If this were a perfect world, a simple world where everything and everyone were as they appeared to be, then this would be a simple story. A perfect story of how a woman named Patricia played the hero, the Good Samaritan, a stranger helping some poor soul stranded by the side of the road, a man who waved helplessly, it seemed, in the dark. And where everyone else, they'd kept driving, kept going. Hers was the car that stopped. But this isn't a perfect world. This is the true crime world. Our dead sleep world. Where what happened to Patricia that night in 1995, somewhere along a deserted road in the wilderness of Colorado, it would not be a good deed. And Patricia would not be known as a good Samaritan, but as an unwitting, unwilling eyewitness in a violent murder, or so she thought. It was a death that police would say was an accident. But for Patricia, it would become a nightmare, an incident she would try to push away for nearly 20 years. Only the memory of what really happened that night, it would come back to haunt her when that killer, he struck again. This is a story about 3 women, 2 victims, and the one witness, a stranger. The crucial link between these 2 different women, their 2 mysterious deaths, and what she saw as darkness fell that night. It could make the difference between 2 grieving families getting justice, or one ruthless killer going free. This is Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. If you are new to this podcast, you've likely found Dead Sleep because you maybe searched for true crime and sleep. Well, you're not alone. A few years ago, I did that too. And I simply couldn't find anything that was compelling, real-life, true crime storytelling without the gore, the violence, or the loud, obnoxious ads every 3 minutes, blasting me awake. So I created Dead Sleep for people like me. And as always, Dead Sleep is 100% listener-supported and ad-free. There are currently over 80 episodes available to anyone who wants to listen completely ad-free. But if you would like to enjoy bonus episodes each month as a subscriber, you can do so via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts, with an opportunity to try it free, a free month on Apple Podcasts, and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. It is every writer's, every creative person's dream to be able to create something that connects with people. So however you got here, I am so happy that you're here. And here's more about tonight's episode. It's similar to last week, where we covered the Murdaugh family murders. And we approached that story from a perspective you may not have heard before. Tonight is something similar. It's a true crime story that's been covered very well in a few different shows, including a book by a well-known true crime writer named Michael Fleeman, which of course I will link to in the show notes. It's called The Black Widower. But as always, this is the Dead Sleep version of events. It's all factual, just with my own twist on things. where we take a different point of view. We explore the whole saga with a fresh perspective, with lots of extra details and detours to fatigue our overactive minds. And so for tonight's story, we don't start with someone's terrible nightmare. We start in the place where so many of us make the best memories. With our closest family and friends. On the drive home after a wonderful day. It was May 6th, 1995. For some, it feels like yesterday, but it was a long time ago, where somewhere on a radio station, the #1 song was Montel Jordan's "This Is How We Do It." Meanwhile, somewhere in a courthouse in Los Angeles, a jury was trying to figure out how or if O.J. Simpson really did it. And that's the funny thing about memory. It's not the numbers, the days, blowing off of the calendar that measures our time here on Earth. It's those events, big and small, that stick with us. It's the things we see, what we hear, how we feel, that leaves the lasting imprint. And that day, May 6th, as 30-something Patricia Pat Montoya and her then-husband, his brother, and another friend made their way along a scenic drive in Colorado. It was looking like this was going to be the perfect memory. The memories of the good times, of this drive, with sunglasses on, music playing, Pat happily married, at least for the moment. Pat and her crew were from Denver, which was a beautiful city in itself, but it was still a city. And as the Jeep crawled up Highway 67 into the Colorado wilderness, roughly an hour's drive outside of Denver, they took in the majesty of the snow-capped mountains, breathed in the bracingly fresh air. And as night fell and the temperature dropped so low it felt more like winter than spring, that was Colorado for you. At least they were all in the Jeep, all warm and cozy and safe and relaxed. This was supposed to be the memory. All four had been drinking that day, and while nobody was wasted, they were maybe over the limit. But in those Colorado mountains, life feels like it has no limits. Then, around 10 o'clock at night, the flash of a man, waving in a frantic panic. It was like an ice-cold bucket of water over that warm buzz. Fear sobering everyone up instantly. Looking at the guy, a big 30-something white guy with dark brown hair, wild-eyed and panicked, waving to them from the side of the road. He looked like he was in trouble, though it was too dark to really see what exactly was happening. Pat wasn't sure. Should they keep going? Or should they stop? You just never knew about people. And being from Denver, and this being the 1990s, where carjackings made headlines, Pat was wary of just about everyone. But she figured she was with people, her husband, another male friend, and if anything bad happened, together they could handle it. Right? And the man looked so hysterical, If they didn't slow down and help, who would? The man, he was saying a lot of words, but once distilled, it came down to 4 crucial details. His wife, accident, car, crushed. Pat, her husband, and their 2 friends pulled over, and they looked at the gray Jeep Cherokee off the side of the road. Pat saw a flash of the woman's feet first. Then, as she approached closer, she saw her body, face down, her arms just over her head. The right front tire that should have been there was gone. It was like somehow the entire front of the Jeep, well, the whole car, had collapsed and now appeared to be resting on the body of this woman. The heavy round metal rotor of the right front wheel pressed onto her back. Pat learned the man's name was Harold. In the scenario that this Harold laid out, it was bizarre. Harold and his wife Lynn, they were from Littleton, Colorado, just outside of Denver. And they too had been on a scenic drive until Harold claimed they got a flat tire. So they pulled over right here in this little nook, far out in the woods. And well, what happened next would be a frenetic jumble of bits and pieces, a story that never really added up. But Harold said he went to jack up the Jeep, but the tire jack, it didn't work. So we had to improvise. And he improvised with a boat jack. And that boat jack, it wasn't sturdy. It wasn't the right fit. But he managed to get the tire off, and as he went to the back of his Jeep to throw the tire into the back of the trunk and grab the new one, it seems his wife Lynn, she went under the car to retrieve something. He thinks it was a lug nut. And while she was on her stomach, stretching herself underneath the car to get to that lug nut, the Jeep teetered off the jack, and it fell on her, trapping her under the bald metal tire rotor, as heavy as a boulder. Pat didn't say it out loud, but one of her immediate thoughts was, what kind of dumbass lets his wife crawl under a car to get a lug nut? Pat had changed a fair share of flat tires. She and her husband also had a Jeep. These Jeeps, they usually had 5 lug nuts, but you don't need them all to fix a flat tire. You could use 4, even 3 to hold the spare tire in place, at least long enough to make it home safe. And then there was another weird detail: the shower curtain. Harold would claim he happened to have a shower curtain in the back of the Jeep, and he decided to lay the shower curtain down before he went to fix the tire. Who needed a shower curtain to fix a flat? This dude was clueless. But soon, those aggravated thoughts, they dissipated when she saw the condition of Harold's wife, Lynn. She and her friends snapped into action, and it was a whirl of activity. This was the era before cell phones, but they knew this situation was dire, and someone needed to find a phone to call 911. Pat found her way to the nearest house, managed to find a man inside. He called and assured Pat the police and an ambulance, they were on the way. By then it was just after 10:30, and back at the car, somehow, they managed to liberate Lynn's body from underneath that rotor. they turned Lynn over. Lynn was around Pat's age, in her 30s. She had pale skin, almost luminescent in the dark night. A beam of a flashlight would reveal Lynn's signature golden red hair. But to Pat, and anyone else on that scene, Lynn was just a woman in bad shape. Conscious barely. They began performing CPR. If they could just keep Lynn going until the ambulance arrived. But as Pat focused on Lynn's husband, Harold, zeroed in on Pat and her friends, yelling at them to stop it, to stop touching her, to leave her alone. They were confused. If they didn't help, his wife could die. Maybe Harold thought by moving her they would hurt her more. But he didn't seem concerned. He seemed angry, agitated. And Pat, she began to get a strange feeling about this man. What was really going on here? By then, the temperature had dropped so low, it was nearly freezing. Whatever Lynn's condition, she needed to stay warm. It was suggested that Harold take off his coat and put it on his wife. But he didn't move. So Pat, she took off her own jacket, as did her friends, and they laid them over Lynn to keep her warm. And with that drop in temperature came a chilling realization that maybe Harold didn't want his wife to live. That maybe he'd brought her out here to die. And this whole thing, them being there, was part of some performance. Witnesses to this so-called accident. Pat believed she wasn't looking at the face of a concerned, frightened husband, but face to face with a mean-eyed, cold-hearted killer. Then in the distance, the faint sound of sirens. An ambulance, the police, they would be here any minute. Pat remembered looking at Harold's face, and his face didn't look relieved. He looked panicked. And Pat and everyone else in the car, they were also panicked. They worried that not a single one of them would pass a breathalyzer test. And if they stuck around, at least one of them, Pat's husband, the driver, could end up getting arrested and going to jail. By then, a small group of people had gathered, the ambulance seconds away. Pat and her husband, they determined they'd done everything they could, and now they better go. Pat, her husband, and the two others all jumped into the car and left. But no matter how far, how fast they drove that night, the memory of what happened, it followed them. And they all agreed, with a shudder, this was no accident. That bastard, Harold, he wanted his wife dead. And there was nothing they could do about it now, except hope, pray, that the ambulance would come in time. and Harold wouldn't succeed. He wouldn't get away with it. What happened that night? Harold, his wife Lynn, the Jeep, the collapse. It would undoubtedly be big news. This was front page stuff. In the 1990s was the dawn of true crime as we know it today. The 24-hour news cycle. Lynn's saga, undoubtedly, would be front and center. But what would the headline be? Pat could only hope the headline was something about how a 30-something man named Harold, what was his last name? That he was arrested for trying to kill his wife Lynn. The key word, of course, in this imaginary headline was arrested for trying to kill his wife. Fingers crossed, Lynn was alive and in the hospital somewhere, and capable of telling the police all about what happened to her husband, how he was a dangerous man and tried to kill her by somehow, well, honestly, it was still a mystery to Pat and those who were there after the fact that night. How exactly he made his Jeep so lethal it pinned his wife to the ground like a wrestling move. His Jeep Cherokee operating like a transformer, some evil forerunner version of Megatron. Statistically speaking, the likelihood of being struck by a car while changing a tire, well, it would happen by being struck by another car, one that might have veered too close to the side of the road. But being crushed by your own car as you situated yourself underneath the rotor. She just couldn't picture it. If this was difficult for Pat to fathom, certainly the police would have found this suspicious. But there were no headlines in the newspaper about Lynn, her death, or Harold, her husband, and possible killer. There were plenty of other terrible things happening, of course. It was month 4 of the O.J. Simpson trial. Though the news, that early May, was centered on the landmark wrongful death lawsuit in the murders of 35-year-old Nicole Brown Simpson and 25-year-old Ron Goldman. This wrongful death lawsuit, at the time, was the most high-profile of its kind, and probably the first time that we could remember someone being found not guilty of one, but responsible in the other. As we all know, O.J. Simpson was found not guilty in that double murder trial, but found liable in the civil case, and later ordered to pay the Browns and the Goldmans just over $30 million in damages back in 1997. It was an amount of money O.J. Simpson only paid a fraction of before he died in 2024. A settlement that was only recently resolved this past November in 2025, when Simpson's estate agreed to pay Ron Goldman's father, Fred, close to $60 million plus interest accrued over the roughly 30 years since that 1997 decision. A reminder of those glacially paced wheels of justice. Back in Denver, it wouldn't take Pat that long to find out what happened to Lynn. But it was not what she expected. The news item that appeared, it was buried in the back, and it was very brief. And the headline read, simply, "Woman Crushed Under Car." And it went on to say how a 37-year-old woman was crushed to death when a car slipped off a jack while she and her husband were changing a flat tire, authorities said. The newspaper item went on to say it was an accident. An accident. At a certain point, Pat felt compelled to call up the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. She had two questions. The first was when she could retrieve the jean jacket that she'd left behind, the one she'd put on Lynn because, well, Lynn's husband had refused to sacrifice his, which led her to the second question, a question that was more urgent. In so many words, she asked, when did they plan to arrest the husband, this Harold Henthorne? Because Pat was there, and what happened, she could assure you, was no accident. There were other witnesses who had concerns about what happened that night. A husband and wife contacted the police to report what they saw. This couple, they said as they drove along Highway 67 the night of May 6th, they said it was around 9:30, which was about a half an hour before Pat and her car showed up. They saw a man and a woman who were on the side of the road trying to change a tire on their Jeep. And this couple, they pulled over to stop and help. And in their recollection, the husband, he waved them away, told them he didn't need or want their help. And, if they might say, he was a little rude about it. There was another post facto claim that someone saw Lynn sitting inside the Jeep, and they thought she looked frightened. And then there was another witness, the one who'd called 911, who'd left his house to help out on the scene, and he remembered Harold acting strangely, that he wasn't even really helping, just pacing nervously back and forth. But of course, police likely recognized all of these after-the-fact impressions had to be taken within the context that these people were reporting this after learning Lynn was dead. But Pat and the people in her car, her fellow witnesses, they were different. They were the ones who arrived on the scene and saw with their own eyes Lynn pinned under that car. Initially, the incident was deemed suspicious, and the authorities on the scene, they spent roughly 48 hours investigating what happened, wondering if it was possible this was a murder case. They interviewed Harold more than once. They impounded his Jeep, dug into his background, spoke with several witnesses, and did end up speaking with Pat herself. But it appeared Pat's sense of urgency and her conviction that it was Harold who had killed his wife, it didn't make a sizable impression on these investigators. There was more. Detectives discovered he and Lynn had insurance policies, and the estimated value of those policies was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There was also some strange and shady behavior in Harold's past. Harold presented himself as successful. At the time, in the mid-1990s, Harold had his master's degree in the study of geology, and he worked in the oil and gas industry. And yet, he was busted in 1994 for stealing a pack of men's underpants from JCPenney. What his explanation was, the investigators' handwritten notes, they don't say. And back then, none of the interviews were recorded. There were no on-scene body cams. Just a smattering of half-legible scrawls by these authorities that overall didn't add up to murder, necessarily. Maybe they would have taken the investigation further. But after the autopsy was performed, a few days after her death, this case was considered closed. The autopsy showed Lynn's injuries on her back and shoulders appeared to be consistent with where Harold said the Jeep landed on his wife. The coroner determined her cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation. It was an accident. And within the week, by May 11th, any further inquiries ground to a halt. The coroner had spoken. That was that. Those working this case, it appears they were largely inexperienced. Two key figures tasked with overseeing the investigation were relative rookies, more incompetent than malicious. Lynn did die from asphyxiation, but there were little details that might have caught the attention of a more experienced investigator. Harold's story, by all accounts, kept changing, and even the facts that stayed the same, they didn't make sense. For instance, Harold said Lynn was helping him fix the tire, that she held some lug nuts in her hand and then dropped them, and at least one rolled under the car. And Lynn got down on the ground, on her stomach, and was reaching underneath the car just before the Jeep lurched and fell on top of her. Someone might have wondered why. The examiner said her nails were clipped and clean, not at all dirty from reaching along the gravel. And then there's basic physics. The top of a lug nut, it is square. So if Lynn dropped one, it's unlikely it would have rolled under the car. Furthermore, a more experienced investigator would have noted that the car was on an incline. And if that lug nut had somehow rolled, it would have rolled down towards the back wheels, not across to the center of the car. And then there was the big thing, the implausibility of what Harold claimed happened. That he had tossed a tire into the back of that Jeep with such a ferocity of velocity. The Jeep lurched forward off of its jack and landed on his wife. Was that possible? Had that happened before? But those questions, they wouldn't be asked for years. On May 12th, 1995, the case notes concluded with the following. This case has been investigated and determined that this death was an accident and no criminal charges will be filed. Soon after, Pat received a form letter. It was from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, letting her know the property they collected that belonged to her was now available for release. Property not claimed within 30 days would be disposed of. Pat did indeed pick up her jean jacket, but the rest she couldn't let go. She had to find out more about Lynn. She only knew this woman as a body, lying on the ground, in need of warmth and care. But now Pat wanted to know, who was Lynn really? With Lynn gone, there was really only one way to find out. This whole thing was wrong. They did not belong here. Lynn didn't belong here. She was only 37 years old. She should be alive. Instead, there they were, Pat and her husband, crashing Lynn Henthorne's funeral. Pat and her husband, they stood in the back, paying their respects, being as unobtrusive as possible. But the potential for awkwardness, for unmitigated disaster, was only as far as a handshake away. Many of Lynn's family members had traveled from their home in Maryland to Colorado, including her parents, her sister, her brothers, a sister-in-law, her best friends. Lynn was clearly loved and led a vibrant life. People reminisced about how back in high school, Lynn Rochelle, as she was known then, was a high achiever, strong-willed and competitive. She was an athlete as well as an accomplished ballet dancer. When she went off to college in Virginia, she majored in social work, her life calling and future career. She met her future husband there too, the big gregarious geology student Harold Henthorne. Harold's specialty was in structural geology for petroleum exploration, identifying areas of the earth that may hold crude oil for future excavation. When Lynn's family met Harold, they loved him. He was outgoing and fun, but he also seemed as strong and steady as the rock formations he studied. The two were married in 1982 and soon settled down in Colorado, eager to start a family. But after a decade or so of trying, they had yet to have success. The desire for children appeared to be a fixation for Harold, who mentioned several times to various authorities that his wife Lynn had undergone procedures to remove fibroid tumors from her uterus, and he told authorities she was scheduled for another surgery just weeks before her death. And Lynn's friends would later say the pressure Harold put on Lynn and the overall control he had over her life, it started to wear Lynn down. And while Lynn and Harold were traditional, they were religious. The whole honor and obey of their wedding vows only seemed to go one way. Though she was young, Lynn suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, which affected her joints, her arms and legs, including her ankles. And yet, people noticed, it was always Lynn waiting on Harold, literally hand and aching foot. But at the funeral, it seemed everybody still loved Harold. And while Pat and her husband didn't have any encounters with him, they did share their condolences with Lynn's family. And Lynn's parents, they appreciated that Pat and her husband were thoughtful enough to show up. And perhaps the outspoken Pat was tempted to say more, like the truth. But what was someone in her situation supposed to say? By the way, your son-in-law killed your daughter? What would happen then? Maybe it was better if her parents believed it was an accident. The truth would remain unspoken, but her memories of that night, they were painfully intact, as if etched in stone. Pat would have nightmares about that night. But what can be most painful isn't the violence, but the guilt that any number of witnesses can feel. That they'd failed, that they didn't do enough. And in a case like this, there was no way to turn back the clock to make things right. Lynn was dead. It was ruled an accident. Move on. And the rest of the world, they did move on. Other than that one small article in the newspaper. The story of Lynn Henthorne, how she died, and the mystery of what happened, it would be forgotten. At least for the next 17 years. As Pat went about her life, which eventually included divorcing her husband, Harold went about his life too, which included getting married. Again. It was 1999, 4 years since Lynn's death. Harold and Lynn's family remained close. And they were excited when he mentioned that he'd met someone, a fabulous woman, a doctor, an ophthalmologist who was originally from Mississippi. They'd met online, and sure, most of their correspondence was online and long distance, but Harold believed she might be the one. Her name was Toni Bertolet. But Harold was wrong. She would not be the one. She would be the two. That is, the second Mrs. Henthorne, who Harold would claim had died from a terrible and tragic accident somewhere deep in the Colorado mountains. It was September 2012. Harold Henthorne hadn't had a job in geology, or any job for that matter, for decades. But Harold, he did study geology, even had a master's degree in structural geology, essentially assessing rock formations, geological folds, and faults to find out where oil and gas might be trapped and extracted, like a geological treasure hunt. It was Harold's background, however inflated. His background in geology was one of the things that connected Harold to the woman who would become his wife, his second wife, Toni. Toni's brother and father were geologists, and they also worked in the oil and gas industry. And oil was also how Toni's family made their fortune. A fortune that was shared with Toni, who had a 4% stake in the family business, which in dollars worked out to be regular monthly payments, sometimes in the tens of thousands of dollars. On that September day in 2012, when Harold took Toni on an arduous off-trail hike, a supposed celebration for their 12-year wedding anniversary. Along that hike, way off-trail, in the Rocky Mountain National Park, Harold could no doubt spout off a few dense geological facts if he'd wanted to. Facts that would put just about anybody to sleep. Like how the Colorado Rockies are the largest mountain system in North America, roughly 3,000 miles, nearly 5,000 kilometers, of jagged, snow-topped peaks, stretching north into Canada and all the way south to New Mexico. The Rocky Mountains, they are indeed massive rocks, raised by the shifting of the Earth's tectonic forces. But the oldest rocks, that formed an estimated 1.7 billion years ago, are Precambrian sedimentary argillite, along with limestone and dolomite. He also likely knew that the highest point of the Rocky Mountains is Mount Elbert, at 14,000 feet. It's the second highest peak in all of the United States. The first is Mount Whitney in California. For any city people, would be like stacking 10 Empire State Buildings on top of one another. Of course, for what Harold had planned, he didn't need 14,000 feet. He just needed an isolated cliff top where no one could see him or his second wife, Toni. You see, after the death of his wife, Lynn, Harold used all of the skills he gleaned in exploratory geology into a more lucrative personal prospect: the acquisition of a future fiancé through what you might call financial, emotional fracking. Harold would go out on first dates with women he met online and then do a real drill down on what they did for a living. Did they own their own home? Did they have a portfolio? How much money did they make? But by the time he connected with Toni, it seemed he'd refined his extraction process. She found him charming and confident and attractive. Back in 1999, when Harold and Toni met, they were adults, but their romance appeared to be more like the rush of young love. It seemed like a whirlwind. Toni and Harold, they were long distance. She in Mississippi, he in Colorado. They'd really only known each other for a few months and only seen each other in short bursts before they got engaged. By the turn of the 21st century, around the year 2000, the two were married, and Toni went off to Colorado, and it seemed off into her happily ever after. But their union was far from whirlwind. At least for Harold, it was crudely calculated. The death of his wife, Lynn, had left him with a life insurance settlement in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But then, 4 years later, he needed a new income stream. Harold claimed to have a successful and noble career working in nonprofits as a professional fundraiser. But this would later prove to be completely untrue. He couldn't raise enough funds to pay his own bills. Throughout Toni and Harold's 12-year marriage, Harold never had a job. He sponged off of Toni without her knowledge, because he eerily pretended to head out to his non-existent meetings, even go off on business trips, only to spend most of his days, most of his life, sitting for hours and hours each day at a fast casual bakery cafe chain called Panera Bread. Like Lynn, Toni was religious and traditional, which meant even though she was fantastically successful in her career, she let Harold, as the husband, oversee their finances. And sure, it might sound naive or foolish, but this was a matter of trust. And both Lynn and Toni were loving, trusting, giving people. But over time, Toni apparently grew suspicious of Harold, and she began redirecting her funds from their shared bank account into her own bank account. And by 2012, Harold realized the never-ending supply of money it showed signs of drying up. And Harold needed to find another way to mine his money from Tony, strategically taking out multiple life insurance policies that once added up would give him a cumulative payout of roughly $4 million. And similar to his first wife, Lynn, he exploited the pristine and unspoiled beauty of the Colorado mountains for his dirtiest, most underhanded deeds. Harold Henthorne's devious plot in the murder of his wife, Tony, reflected exactly who he was: ostentatious, arrogant, cruel, and cowardly, concocting a darkly elaborate surprise getaway with theatrical flourish, manipulating her colleagues into thinking he was taking his beloved away for a wonderful weekend back to nature, only to drag Tony on a miles-long hike that was, in truth, her death march. And much like Lynn, Tony's death was at once a brutal shock and then a long, slow, terrible decline. Back in 1995, Lynn slowly suffocated to death, the life squeezed out of her under the crushing weight of a 4,000-pound Jeep. Tony was pushed off of a cliff top around the height of a 14-story building, tall enough to cause severe and painful injuries, but also forced her to potentially suffer for hours at the bottom of that cliff until her death. All the while knowing it was Harold who'd done it. The same man who would claim to be by his wife's side, trying to save her life. Once again, as with Lynn, the exact how of it all, nobody could say for sure. There were no witnesses to either incident until after the fact. But anyone who visited where Harold took Tony, the location was dangerous and bleak. An uninviting, inhospitable patch of rocks and dirt, far from the main trails, where no reasonable person would suggest as a place to enjoy a romantic moment. And that's the saddest part of both scenarios. Both women likely sensed something bad was going to happen, but perhaps unwilling to believe the person they loved, they trusted, they'd married, was really capable of doing what he did. Suspending their disbelief, perhaps, only accepting this brutal betrayal in the final moments of their lives. For as much as Harold claimed to know about rocks and hiking and nature, he didn't end up knowing much about the national park system. And what Harold didn't realize was no matter how far into the wilderness he went to kill Tony, he couldn't elude the fact that he killed someone on federal land. And there were top-notch investigators in that park system, along with the FBI, authorities who believed Harold killed his wife and were prepared to do whatever it took to prove it. And this would entail enlisting the help of Patricia Montoya. Nearly 17 years after Lynn's death, Pat received an unexpected phone call. It was from a detective in Douglas County, the county that originally handled Lynn's case back in 1995. And this detective more or less, asked Pat what she remembered about the death of Lynn Henthorne. And her answer to that was essentially, everything. Now, Pat wasn't the only person who came forward to share their suspicions around Lynn's death after news of Tony's death was made public. But Pat was one of the only people who saw what happened that night and could remember crucial details about what happened with Lynn that night, including the condition she was found in and what her final moments were like, along with Harold's unusual behavior. And it took a few years to gather everything together, but eventually, Harold did stand trial for the murder of his wife, Tony. Investigators and prosecutors were very careful with how they framed the material around Lynn's death, that they weren't trying to prove that he killed Lynn, only draw connections between these two deaths, and at least at that time, they had no plans to charge him with murder, possibly due to lack of evidence. But Pat's account of what happened helped draw a crucial connection between the suspicious death of his first wife and the suspicious death of his second. And that testimony, in part, helped secure a guilty verdict against Harold in 2015, where a jury found him guilty of murdering his wife, Tony. And he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With Harold locked in prison, Pat could now be free. 17 years of nightmares, at long last, put to rest. And now it's time for us to rest. Thank you, as always, for listening and supporting my podcast. It means everything. And I always say this, but this is just one small molecule of a much larger story. And I encourage you to check out the original sources, if you haven't already, in the show notes. I am working on the bonus episode for January, and it's going to take a little bit of time. So there will not be an episode this coming week, but a mega bonus episode the last week of January, around January 28th. I look forward to sharing it with you. Until next time, nighty-night.